our tradition with our last theme, our last session, is to pick a big theme from the conference that kind of ties a lot of things together, to assemble a panel of thoughtful people and to challenge them to think about these big issues, and to do this in a way that's very much a question and answer and interactive type thing, and to aggressively rely on audience questions as we get into this a bit. So it is as interactive pretty much as we can get. And so when it works, it's beautiful. And when it doesn't, well, then you can go home afterwards. So, but the key to the whole thing is the moderator. So I've recruited a very talented person to do this, Jason Robeson, who you kind of know already from his work asking questions up there. If you don't know Jason, he is, I've been going back and forth on this, Jason, between calling you one of the most productive scholars I know, or the most productive scholar I know. I think I'll stick with the former just because I don't want to alienate any of my other scholarly friends. But man, God, Jason gets things done. He's at the University of Wyoming, where he's the Carl Williams Professor of Law and Social Responsibility. He's also the co-director of the Gina Guy Center. He's the adjunct professor in the Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources. There's probably a half dozen other things there. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and the University of Oregon Law School, because doing just one wouldn't be sufficient. I mean, that tells you all you need to know about him here. And I feel like he's a member of the GWC in that he's worked here before with me on some stuff. And now that he has no official affiliation with us, but yet pretty much every project that I've worked on in the past 6 months, Jason, one way or another, has been involved, whether it's been helping students or our water fellow or other things. So I offer a sincere thank you for that. He's one of the folks on the Water and Tribes. He's on the leadership team of the Water and Tribes Initiative. So that's part of the glue that helps connect that group with the GWC here. So I've built you up pretty high here, for better or for worse. But I will hand it off to him, and he's got a plan for this. So it'll be great. All right.
Thank you, Doug. How's the lapel mic? Good times? All right, awesome. I can shorten Doug's introduction of me, which is this guy is like a bad rash or one of those bugs that won't leave you alone in the summertime, right? Yeah, no, it's such a privilege to be here. For those of you who might be in a little bit of a food coma from lunch, totally understandable, but this panel aspires to lift your minds, hearts, and spirits to the top of the Flatirons. That's what we're going to do. And I'm so grateful to have been asked to moderate it. And I know that in expressing that, I'm channeling the feelings of my co-panelists. Big honor, big event. There's so many people you could ask to talk on the topics that we're going to broach, and we appreciate getting the nod and the chance very much. Second thing, and I think this is tradition too, if not, it should be. I can only imagine how much time goes into putting together this conference. I have a sense of that as an outsider, but not as an insider. And so what I'd like to ask my co-panelists and folks in the audience to do is to join me in a round of applause for Annie, Doug, Chris, WTI folks, etc. You're doing a service to the Basin community when you bring us all together to have these conversations. And I mean that in total seriousness. So grateful. As far as this panel goes, the question of who and how came up yesterday afternoon in that powerful trifecta panel with my co-conspirator, Celine Hawkins, Ann Castle, and our third panelist. Remind me, Celine, if you would. But Catherine Sorensen, thank you very much. No, is it a Chihuahua or a muffin? I remember that, yeah. That's not upper basin blockage, I hope. But the question of who and how came up there in relation to water conservation. And in fact, I think I posed that question to Catherine on behalf of the audience member who had presented it. There is an unmistakable continuation of this who and how thread vis-a-vis the remarks this morning from Becky, John, and Carlos, as well as our tribal leaders. And by who and how, what I'm referring to is who has a voice in decision-making over Colorado River management? How does decision-making over Colorado River management occur? How do you design processes? Not just the substantive measures that come out of processes, but how do you design processes to get people to work together? Yes, Kalila, totally, et cetera. So this recurring emphasis on who and how is something that this panel is going to pick up on or continue on. And beyond its relevance at this event, the only additional thing I would flag is it's something that obviously scholars and policymakers have thought about for decades. You can see it in all kinds of writing. Recently, in the Colorado River Research Group's Dancing with Deadpool report from 2025, check out Chapter 8 if you're interested. John Berggren, Matt McKinney, Doug, and myself made an effort to advance this who and how question. Prior to that, decades prior to that, we had the former dean and professor of this law school, David Getchis, weighing in on the subject. And for those of you who are familiar with Getchis's writing, in 1997, he wrote a path-breaking article about Colorado River governance that gets cited so much. But that is just to say that that's 30 years ago now. And people have been thinking about the who and the how of Colorado River management and decision-making over it since then. I would also put a plug in the more recent sense for Water and Tribes Initiatives, Tribal Sovereignty Policy Brief. There are hard copies out there. There are online copies as well posted on the WTO website. This was put together in the spirit of wanting to clarify, provide more content about what tribal sovereignty is as a concept. It's one thing to throw the word around. It's another to try to drill down and try to understand what it really means, and to suggest that that meaning, that clarity, that precision is important if we're talking about Colorado River management. That understanding tribal sovereignty is critical to engaging in good Colorado River management. So I put a plug in for this policy brief as well in the thread of who and how. Okay, so that's the overall thread that we're pursuing. This panel aims to advance dialogue about who and how in decision making, or if you want to call it this, problem solving over the Colorado River. The panel is founded on a core principle, and that is that current management challenges along the Colorado River are internationally relevant. This river, put differently, is an extremely relevant case study. The things that are going on along the river now, the decisions that are having to be made, are relevant across the world. And we very much hope, both with respect to the in-person audience and the Zoom audience, that international significance of this river basin is appreciated and understood. Not only do the challenges that have been discussed confront 40 million people in Western North America, how those challenges are navigated and by whom are critical subjects for countless other human beings and non-human relations in other major river basins currently encountering or projected to encounter similar challenges going forward. So we very much hope that you recognize the gravity or see things similarly in terms of the gravity of the issues being discussed and their relevance on a global scale. It falls to these individuals to lead this dialogue, right? As if the mantle's not heavy enough, in conjunction with all of you. And by all of you, I mean, of course, folks in person and on Zoom. We really want your engagement. We really want to solicit that engagement both during Q&A and, as I'll elaborate at the end of this session, electronically via email and a web page that's been built for this panel as an outgrowth of this panel that I'll give you more info about once the panel runs its course. As far as the panelists, I guess the best way to do it is just go from the far end this way. We have James Eklund from Taft, water law attorney here in Denver and Colorado. Samantha Barncastle from Family Farm Alliance in New Mexico, Las Cruces, if memory serves. Daryl Vigil, who needs no introduction, everybody knows Daryl, but co-chair of the Water and Tribes Initiative, among other things, and John Berggren at Western Resource Advocates, the regional policy director for Colorado River matters or issues. I was doing the math, and there's well over a half century of experience on this panel over Colorado River decision making. So I say that, I guess, for a couple reasons. One is to just to highlight that maybe like all of that half century might be in Daryl alone. I mean, there is that, right? But no, in all seriousness, to say this is quite a crowd to pose hard questions to. These are folks like others in the room and online who've chosen to devote significant chunks of their lifetimes to the Colorado River, of their working lives. And so, again, grateful to have the chance to work with you all. And to the audience, I would just encourage you to capitalize on it, to make use of their expertise, to ask hard questions, if you would. The panel is structured in conversational format, or to put it more particularly, facilitated dialogue. This is going to be a real conversation about the who and how questions. One part of the conversation is going to be among the panelists based on questions that we've prepared ahead of time after deliberating over them quite a bit, and we thought would be worthwhile to discuss for everyone. So these are kind of the short list of questions, who and how questions that we thought would be best to bring to the audience. Another part of the conversation aims, though, to draw from all of you, and that applies, again, in person and over Zoom. We want to reach out across the Basin community about the who and how questions through Slido Q&A initially, and again, as I'll elaborate at the end of the session, through a web page built for this purpose. But overall, our goal is to think intently with a lot of intentionality about the who and how of decision-making over Colorado River management. And with that goal in mind, we've really used time as a principle to organize the questions, either short-term or long-term. As far as the former goes, our initial questions are going to focus on the thing that I think has been most visible in most folks' minds throughout this event, and that is the post-2026 process. The process for adopting operating guidelines for Lake Powell and Lake Mead after the expiration of the existing guidelines, December 31st of 2026. So the first question focused on P2026, which I'll refer to it as in shorthand, comes from a place of gratitude and humility. And that is, panelists, I'm going to ask you each to at least chime in on one topic, and John graciously offered to go first. What, in your view, has worked in the process of developing the post-2026 operating guidelines, and why?
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. Thanks for that setup. Thanks for the context, and thanks for the kind introduction. And I am honored to be on this panel with this wealth of expertise, fully aware that I bring the fewest number of years to the half century, so I'm looking forward to learning from my co-panelists. And so in terms of what has worked well with the post-2026 process, in my mind, it's been what Reclamation has done so far with the NEPA process, and setting up the NEPA process, soliciting alternatives from anyone could submit alternatives, incorporating many of those alternatives they received, analyzing them, including them in the draft EIS. Those alternatives represent a broad range of how to manage the system. There are a lot of things in those alternatives that could be very helpful for the basin. So I think that was a very helpful thing they did. And their analysis too, using DMDU principles, decision-making under deep uncertainty, that was a really helpful step forward, something relatively new for a federal agency to do, and I think that really helped understand how those alternatives perform given all the uncertainties with climate change. And so really appreciative of that. They, like I said, they solicited alternatives from anyone. Myself and 6 other NGOs got to submit one of the alternatives. Reclamation took it basically whole cloth except for the name. We submitted the cooperative conservation alternative, we thought was a good name. They changed it to the maximum operational flexibility alternative. A bit of a tongue twister, but everything else was the same. They took our ideas seriously and they analyzed them. And one thing I did want to note from the analysis that I thought was really, really helpful was that DMDU framework. There's a figure they included in the draft EIS. It's buried deep in one of the appendixes of the 1,200-page document, but it really helps understand the fundamental question, which is what kind of river are we going to plan for? And they looked at the range of traces in the analysis, and they looked at all the alternatives and said, here's how the alternatives perform, here's the type of river they can plan for. In some of the more status quo alternatives, it was like 12, 13 million acre foot is the type of river that alternative could handle. When you got to some of the other alternatives that had more policies, more programs, more tools, more flexibilities, more things in them, they could handle rivers, a river as low as 8 or 9 million acre feet. And so that's figure TA 4-3, I want to say. But look at it, it's incredibly helpful, and it just makes it, given Brad Udall's talk yesterday, what are we going to plan for? I think anyone who's planning for even a 12 million acre foot river is not the right approach. 11 million acre feet, still, even a year ago, we were talking about planning for 11 million acre feet. I think, is it a 10 million acre feet? Is it lower? And so understanding that and what is necessary to plan for that type of river came out of that analysis that Reclamation did. I'm really appreciative of that work. So I'll stop.
Awesome, thanks so much, John. Other panelists, so again, our overall thread here is which aspects of the post-2026 process are you willing to point to as working well? Do any of the other panelists have topics that weave in well, that connect well with what John has offered? Any takers?
Well, I do.
Sam?
Believe it or not, I am a firm believer that so far the collaborative process has worked. And the reason I say that is because when you spend any amount of time in Washington, D.C., you know that there is a very small group of individuals who actually understands what's happening out here, who actually understand the West, they understand the issues that we're dealing with, and they're willing to do the work on those. So the vast majority of people we are talking to in Washington, D.C. have no concept of how we live or what is hitting us. And so the collaborative efforts that we've started deploying, we have coalition letters, we have environmental, tribal, and agriculture working together. We have cities stepping up and private equity stepping up to look towards solutions. And while the conversations remain difficult, they will forever. It's a fallacy to believe that we're going to settle this and come up with regulations and then move on with our lives. This will be a continuing process forever. And the fact that we can sit at dinner together with an upper basin and a lower basin compact negotiator and have a good time and smile at each other and be genuine, it shows that at least some of what we're doing is working. And so I would point to collaboration.
Okay. James, Daryl, care to chime in on that thread?
This is a tricky one right out the gate, Professor, because I don't see it working, and I don't see much. We're in the business of delivering results, and if we think otherwise, then we've got the wrong homework assignment. We've got to do a lot more, a lot faster than we've done, and I guess, you know, there might be people have called it silver lining, or one good thing that has come out of the post-2026 process is just the threat of federalization of the river shaking the states awake and making some progress. If we want to keep that, really it's a heritage, a birthright even for at least people in Colorado and the Upper Basin that have long labored to maintain their status as the administrators of water in the West when it has been lost in the Lower Basin to the Secretary of the Interior as the water master as a result of the Arizona v. California case. In the Upper Basin, we have jealously guarded the ability, so much so that we did another compact in 1948 to preserve the ability to administer our own water here. So, Gene Breitenstein, I think a graduate of this law school, and the Attorney General that negotiated that 1948 compact ended up, I think he would be rolling in his grave right now that we are this close to handing the keys to the car to the federal government. So that's as optimistic as I can be about it.
Very candid. Daryl, you are the last person standing. What insights do you have on this thread?
Yeah, before I jump into that, I just wanted to comment on, I'm grateful that Governor Lewis and Chairwoman Flores and Chairman Whiteskunk made the comments that they did. And one of the reasons is because, I started in this conversation 16 years ago, and 16 years ago, there was a dapper Native American man that would sit at every CRUA conference, and I was new to this, and he would just sit and listen and watch, but that was Rod Lewis. And I always really appreciated that because, he showed up. He suited up and he showed up, and that got the results for his tribe. And I'll always be grateful because I was here in 2016 doing a talk upstairs, and Dr. Charles Wilkinson sat in the first row and he listened to me talk. And afterwards, I met him in the hallway. He just smiled at me and he gave me a hug. And I hope that means a whole lot to me in terms of my history at this university, but my history and my connection with those human beings that have been incredibly valuable to me in my trajectory in terms of being of service. And so I'll be forever grateful for that. But the one thing that, CRIT is doing right now in terms of creating the personhood of the river, thank you, my sister, Chairwoman Flores. I've been working with her for so long, and then before her, I worked with her brother, TJ, on the 10 Tribes Partnership. So I have a long history with Chairwoman Flores' family, and I'm grateful to have that connection, and I'm grateful to CRIT. You know why? Because, the reality is in this country is that, there's still 80%, not still, yeah, there still is, but the reality is 80% of this country doesn't know that indigenous people still exist. 80%. And so why does a living personhood for a river become important? It's absolutely in line with the conversations we're having right now and the urgency, the existential threat of climate change I talked about the first day, but and then in connection with what Jason was talking about in terms of the release of our policy brief, and that is that CRIT is fighting for recognition of personhood for a river. But that helps us as indigenous people because maybe that'll connect the dots as recognizing our humanity and that we are still living here. We're not gone. We're not fictional characters. We're still here. And in my home state, we quibble about Chaco, but it's like, that was thousands of years ago. My Pueblo relatives are still here and they need help. They really do. So why concentrate on a place that we left a long time ago when we're still here and we need those things? And so I want to say that up front because, and I'll get to post-2026, but this is just so incredibly foundational in terms of, the understanding that, where tribes are at in terms of, wow, we have to declare personhood for the river. So hopefully the rest of this country will acknowledge our personhood. And and so, you know, when we think about, you know, these things, and I'm grateful that Chairman Lewis brought up again, you know, in our state, which is the bottom of the worst of the worst states, inside of that are 24 tribal sovereigns who are at the worst of the worst. And, you know, when we talk about, he talked about diabetes, and I kid about this a little bit, but, you know, my people are being killed by frozen pizzas now. And I say that jokingly, but we suffer at the highest levels of diabetes, alcoholism, heart disease. So the genocide continues. The calculated termination of indigenous people in this country continues. And the evidence is so apparent in terms of we went through a global pandemic. And because the 30 tribes in the basin don't have that proverbial seat, don't have that sovereignty acknowledged. And if your sovereignty is acknowledged, then you're dehumanized and your concerns and need become less of a priority. And in that climate of a global pandemic, we died at twice the rate. We died. Like people, my Aunt Ann died on a ventilator and we couldn't send her off. We contracted the disease at 3.5 times the rate. And you ask yourself, why? No settlement, lack of settlement implementation, lack of recognition of tribal sovereignty, and lack of an ability to be self-determined, to take care of your own people. I can't imagine being a tribal leader and having to watch your people die because not one single state leader or federal leader has said this in 2 days now, that the priority should be universal access to clean water so people don't die. And I'm grateful for Ann Castle for filling in those gaps with the Universal Access to Clean Water Act, because we're talking about alfalfa when people are dying. Come on. That's unacceptable to me. And so when we talk about this and the existential threat of climate change, you know, I mean, and Brad's, my good friend Brad, you know, I mean, Udall, you know, he's been saying it for over a decade or so in terms of the urgency. And if people are dying, and if the impacts of climate change are absolutely unpredictable, there is no new normal, then why aren't we treating it with that kind of urgency? We set out and told and recommended to the 7 basin states representatives at the get-go, put your egos and your self-righteousness and your possessiveness aside. Get a mediator. You know, the ego and the presumptuousness of that we're going to solve this ourselves is not acceptable to me. And the last thing I'll say about this one thing before we get, because there's a whole lot more to say in terms of the realities and the justifications of why we need transformation. 16 years ago, at my first plenary session at Colorado River Association, I was listening to the conversation and I raised my hand. I was like, so if the problem is the law of the river, why don't we change the law of the river? It's crazy. And where are we at now? That's where we're at. What did we do? Status quo. And why does status quo not work, especially for indigenous people? Because the settlement era was just recent, almost at the end of the 100-year period. And so our inclusion has been very, 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 very recent. And I'll stop with this because I just wanted to read this, and I'll say more, but this is Article 7 of the Colorado River Compact. It says, nothing in this compact shall be construed as affecting the obligations of the United States of America to Indian tribes. Wow. And guess what? 100 years later, the 30 tribes and sovereigns in the basin having 25% of different future reserve water rights, have no seat at the table. So we talk about legal foundation and legal precedent. What a bunch of bullshit. The legal standpoint is to protect the status quo and those who've been benefiting from prior and beneficial use. But like in my big fat Greek wedding, we suffer. We suffer badly, and we've been suffering badly. We continue to suffer. And that'll be my last point on this subject, because I love that movie, because what we're talking about is apples to oranges. A future reserve right is not the same as a beneficial use right. They're two different animals. That's the first thing. in terms of, that in terms of what's different. The second thing is, we've heard a whole lot of talk about that imaginary line in the sand that separates the upper basin from the lower basin. And guess what what that did for us? It put us at odds with our brothers and sisters, and indigenous brothers and sisters in the lower basin. What a horrible thing to do with people who have been connected to each other for thousands of years, to have us the potential of fighting over water. And the reality of the differences of it's impossible to come to a solution with apples to oranges when the upper basin and the lower basin are apples to oranges. It's not possible. And let's stop living in the matrix, because we don't live in the matrix, tribes don't. We live in the reality of today. And it's not a very nice picture. And I wish I could paint it better for you. But on the positive sides, and so, when we talk about apples and oranges, and at the end, Mr. Bumpalopoulos, or whatever his name was, he goes, well, in the end, we're all fruit. And so on the positive side, absolutely, the collaborative piece has been important. Us connecting at a human level, because that's never happened before. And the magic that happens when you connect humans at a basic value level, then you can really move things. But we've never been asked what our values are until now. And that's the positive thing. There's a clear recognition that thousands of years of adaptable, sustainable living is important. It might be helpful to us planning a future. It's very clear that the tribal sovereigns in this basin into Mexico lived jointly as co-sovereigns for thousands of years, effectively. And so when we talk about sovereignty, I said it the first day, and I'll come full circle to that, and just in terms of the sovereignty, at the heart of it is the recognition of who we are and who the Creator made us as human beings. And the more collaboration and the more connection, because we're going to need that in terms of the building of consensus that obviously hasn't happened in some of the governance structures, but absolutely is happening at a one-to-one human level. And to translate that in those values into good policy into the future. Because if we don't deal with the fundamental issue of climate change, who cares about alfalfa? Because we won't be here. And so let's stop separating ourselves from the environment and take on some humility to understand we're just part of a greater whole, and that's how we thought for thousands of years. And I don't like the term fight. I kept hearing that today. I'm going to fight for this, and I honor that, because if that's what you need to do, that's what you need to do. But I understand, given the nature that 80% of this country doesn't understand us or doesn't know that we exist, and we're not included in any governance structures, what has fighting got us up to this point? I must stand for transformation. And that's different than fighting, because a stand is based on who I am as a human being and my personal values. And I would assert that those things that were conversations we're having right now are absolutely grounded in those values. And your willingness to be a coalition of the willing this weekend absolutely indicates the trajectory, and the fact that we've had this conference now for 4 years is proof to me that we're on the right human trajectory. But we need to treat it with the urgency that it deserves, because people die, animals die, fish die. And the human arrogance of like determining which ones will survive and which won't, is absolutely inconsistent with my indigenous teachings. So I would love, to think about how we use this 250 years to really blend in what was established over thousands of years.
That long-term perspective, no doubt, we're going to hear more about in relation to the questions on post-P26, longer-term perspectives on the who and the how of Colorado River management. We'll go there. Staying in the P26 space for now, though, I think I might start at the end of the table. It feels like that probably is the right spot to start with the flip question of the initial one. So this question, to set the stage for it, comes from a place of respect, with the idea that constructive criticism, if you really sit with it, is actually a form of respect. But the term constructive, the adjective constructive, is important there, both in terms of being substantively constructive, meaning intended to make things better, but also something we often don't see in popular culture as much nowadays in the United States, procedurally constructive, that is offered with civility and modeling good behavior as far as civics go. So we're going to approach this second question with that mindset, in that spirit. And the second question, initially going to James, is what has not worked in the process of developing the post-2026 operating guidelines, and why?
So that one I can answer a lot quicker than I did the last one. If you've read, there's a whole vein of organizational theory and governance, good governance work that's gone on in academia. I think it culminated best in Ezra Klein's Abundance book. There's the core insight of that being that it's the paradigm. The modern governance systems increasingly reward procedural compliance over actual delivery of what it is you're trying to achieve. Here it's water and a well-run and successfully managed system of water. The institutions become exceptionally good at process. and consultation and litigation management, shareholder choreography. We're doing it right now. While losing the ability to build, decide, execute at a scale and with the sense of urgency that I took away from Daryl's comments are required. And the clock's running. We will have a new regime, whether anybody likes it or not, at the end of this year, probably at the end of this water year, so in October. So applying that paradigm of abundance to the Colorado River, the basin has evolved into a governance structure or devolved into a governance structure that optimizes avoidance of political pain rather than producing the stability, the certainty that other panels have talked about being desired. And so for 2 decades, the river's management architecture has generated all the things that the people in this room have worked on. Endless modeling and really top-notch, front bleeding edge of science, forecasting, incremental interim guidelines by design, 20-year for life on the 07 guidelines, overlapping environmental reviews, stakeholder consultation layers that go on and on, sometimes completely avoiding or missing entire constituencies like 30 sovereign federally recognized tribes. Jurisdictional veto points, everybody gets a veto. And if you run any system like that, you will not get anything done. It's a matter of, it's just the way of the world. And we've got plenty of examples of those. And they're great organizations, don't get me wrong. The Western Governors Association is an awesome organization. I love going to their conferences. I love the thought ideas that are exchanged there. They can't do anything substantive because everybody has a veto. And somebody's not gonna like what you're saying or how you're going to achieve a successful plan on something like the Colorado River. If every single person has a veto, you struggle. And we've struggled in this basin. I think we've had great ambition to have every single person in rooms like this all raise their hand and vote aye for a outcome. And yesterday I had the opportunity to introduce Ken Salazar at the History Colorado Center. This thing called the Freedom Plane is flying around the country. It's visiting 8 cities. It's got all these really cool historic documents in it and that haven't ever been west of the Mississippi. And I highly encourage people to go check them out. But one of the documents there out of the National Archives is the record of the votes that were taken to ratify the Declaration of Independence that created the country's founding. And that vote history shows you that there were states abstaining, there were states voting no, but they all committed to the principle that when they got to a majority, they would all accept the result. And that's how you get out of this problem of requiring unanimous consent every time you go to the bathroom. And that has to change, or we will continue to wrestle with this. And then, like I said, the clock will run out whether we like it or not. And the federalization of the river will be the necessary outcome because that's what we'll have ordered up.
Thanks, James. I really appreciate you offering to kick us off as far as the question on constructive criticisms of the P26 process. I'm not going to micromanage this. Which panelists might like to follow James's comments?
I'll go again. I'm ready. Would you ask your surgeon to change the transmission in your vehicle? Or would you ask your mechanic to operate on your kidneys? And so why are we asking our lawyers to be problem solvers? And I'm a lawyer. I'm a practicing attorney. And I will tell you, and let me just tell you in the form of a joke. I have jokes. What's the difference between a good lawyer and a bad lawyer? Well, a bad lawyer can make a case drag on for a very long time, right? Painfully so. But a good lawyer can make it last even longer. 13 years on the Rio Grande in Texas versus New Mexico, and we didn't make a drop of water, not a single drop of water. We didn't improve our system. We didn't work together towards any reasonable outcome. We weren't looking at solutions. We were asking our lawyers to be problem solvers, and they are not. They are litigators. They have one tool in their toolbox, and that is the courtroom. They will take you to the courtroom successfully every time. And so the corollary of collaboration, right, is what we're doing right now. We're siloing ourselves. We are expecting that legal posturing is going to lead to a positive outcome. And we're expecting that the political boundaries we have set up for ourselves are going to be respected by the river and by the water molecules. And those are just fallacies. We are never going to get where we need to be unless we properly diagnose the problem and then we have the right tool for the job. And we have to figure out a way to pivot away from a zero-sum game. You cannot do that taking the silo approach, putting forward, and I'll tell you, I'm the first one to show up in the US Supreme Court on behalf of my district and say, everybody else here is wrong, my district deserves protection because of X, Y, or Z water law. But that was by necessity because you just never know what those cases are going to do. And so the idea that we're gonna have an original action, we're gonna file the case, we're gonna go through briefing, we're gonna go to trial, and then we're gonna have an outcome and have our decision and we're gonna know what to do. Well, that's, what was your term, bullshit? I'll say it. That's not gonna happen, right? That's just not gonna happen. So we need to ramp up our collaboration. We need to be moving a whole lot faster in terms of funding mechanisms, working together, tearing down those political barriers. We often will look at ourselves and put ourselves, I'm agriculture, in our own silo and say, well, I'm going to protect my rights as against everybody else's. But when you start to look at the other side of that coin and you say, well, hold on, what if my neighbors and I came together? What if we actually tried to figure out solutions that made real water on the ground? And I mean, I have a science background too. I know you can neither create nor destroy water molecules, but I will tell you that we created water through collaboration as a mechanism for resolving the issues in the lower Rio Grande, and we're still continuing that process. It took us years. In fact, one of the cases that they're still litigating, and I'm part of that case still, my family farms, we are involved in the adjudication. It was filed, it's older than me, okay? And it's one of the younger cases in New Mexico when it comes to water law. We're never gonna be done fighting until we figure out a better way to do this, and the better way is figuring out how we can come together and fund solutions to problems. You know, in the beginning, the farmers did not have enough water or funds to settle the West. And we took loans out from the government, we constructed big projects, we paid that back. Some of us now own those projects, but that same deal was not offered to everyone. And that's all they're asking for at this point, and that's all we're asking for, is let's figure out how we can come together so that we're not talking about putting our lawyers' great-grandchildren through law school.
All right, thank you so much, Sam. Daryl, I'm asking you to lead off in the post-2026 questions. So let's jump over. John, we have like 3-4 minutes left on constructive criticisms for the P26 questions. Any constructive criticisms of the post-2026 process?
Yeah, and I can keep it brief and hopefully set up that next conversation, but I think What has not worked in the post-2026 process is no surprise, it's been talked about. It's the basin states negotiations, and I think they've acknowledged that. They don't have an agreement. They've been at it for 2-3 years or longer, and from my perspective, it's closer to litigation than it's ever been. And they've consistently said that litigation is failure. And so I think it is important to acknowledge the incredible difficulty that they're in terms of current guidelines are expiring, there is a deadline, worst snowpack on record, some of the worst runoffs on record, reservoirs at all-time lows, getting lower, emergency operations. So things are incredibly difficult, but we haven't made progress in that basin state negotiation. I think from an outside perspective, do not want to take sides, lower basin versus upper basin, but it does seem like that us versus them mentality has not led to the breakthroughs, the getting out of the silos, and to the actual solutions. And I think John Insminger said it at CRUA this year, it seems like as long as the states keep saying that I've done a lot, I've done enough, as much as I can, and the other people need to do more, we're not gonna get to the breakthrough. And I think kind of maybe the segue to the next part of the conversation is what Becky said this morning, which I really appreciated, which was the hydrology is changing faster than our governance is changing. Mm-hmm. And we need to recognize that and respond to that and figure out what needs to be changed with that governance, what needs to be broadened, break down the silos to actually get to the solution. So I'll leave it at that.
That's a perfect baton pass. I so appreciate it. So the remaining questions, which we're going to start with Daryl, look beyond the post-2026 process, potentially far beyond the post-2026 process. And I was thinking of a way to weave into or transition to these questions. Is Kalila still in the room? Have you all noticed the little baby girl from Crit who's been speaking up here and there, almost perfectly punctuated with certain remarks? I have, and I talked with her mom afterwards, after the last panel, and I asked if I could mention her name, and her mom said, yeah, no problem. Kalila, for me, is so appreciated in terms of thinking about the time span or the timeline associated with Colorado River management. And to put that more granularly, as important as it is, and I sincerely mean that, the post-2026 process is the proverbial flash in the pan. The question of who is included in decision-making all over Colorado River management, how decision-making over Colorado River management is structured, those questions should be approached, from my perspective, with an eye towards Kalila and Kalila's grandchildren and so forth, put differently from an intergenerational perspective. And so enough out of me as a moderator, but the point is we're gonna look forward in time more deeply beyond post-2026. So Daryl, initial question goes to you. When you think about Colorado River management beyond the post-2026 guidelines, what suggestions do you have for procedural improvements, particularly with respect to, one, which types of parties are engaged, and two, how processes are designed?
No, thanks for the question, Jason. I'll try to be more brief this time. But one of the things is that, I came to the awareness 16 years ago in terms of River giving me voice and purpose, that part of that clarity that I got from the River was a conversation about equity, justice, and inclusion. And when I got here 16 years ago, there wasn't very much conversation about that, but the River drove that conversation, and it's driven the conversation about what equity, justice, and inclusion should look like structurally, ongoingly. And I just want to say, to start off with, that Northern Arizona settlement you heard about this morning, it's Navajo, I think it's a Paiute and Hopi. And the reason I say this is that, the country's been in place for 250 years, and our compact's been in place for over 100 years now, and settlement process, as I mentioned, has been real recent. And Hopi doesn't have a settlement yet. So in the 250 years of this country's history, a tribe that has been in the Colorado River Basin for thousands of years still doesn't have a certainty for a future because they don't have a water settlement. And there's a lot of other water settlements that aren't complete yet or haven't been fully developed yet or fully recognized. And the one thing you need to understand, I was very vocal over the last 16 years about the archaic nature of the BIA settlement and this federal government settlement process. It's still based on PIA. And the fact that Hickory is a semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe, how do you do, again, apples to oranges? And that's how our settlements were developed. And I tell this story because it's important. The modern settlement era, it was in the late 80s and the early 90s, and my tribe was part of that. But those leaders, including mine, President Levi Posada and Chairman Leonard Birch from Southern Ute, crashed meetings at McCarran Airport at Las Vegas to demand inclusion into CRUA. It was a pretty gatekeeper organization, and to a large extent, it remains one. But, that's what needed to happen. And the reason I mention all these is because we haven't had the privilege of looking into the future. How can you do that without life-giving water to build economies and maybe to reconcile your past so you can create yourselves into the future? Because the genocide really was complete with colonization. We just haven't had a chance to recreate ourselves into the future. Give us that humanity and that opportunity to have that seat at the table, and because it doesn't exist. And I used to laugh because we're at one of the minutes in Santa Fe, and it's like saying the same thing about we need inclusion, we need a seat at the table. And there were some really nice Ches chairs on that stage. And I thought maybe I should have been looking for the Ches chair instead of the table. And but anyway, equity, justice, and inclusion. Whatever, we decide as a collective, and it has to happen very quickly. And I think there's a lot of that happening in all the dialogues. We can determine what those things look like. But I would assert, again, we need transformation. We don't need change, because inclusion demands transformation. Because if we've never been included, then we have to build all new structures. And I love, if you're watching Camille, I love Camille too, because when she was Commissioner of Reclamation, she took it on for the very first time because previous administrations had said, oh, we can't possibly do 30 consultations. Well, yeah, you can. And that's what she did. And Governor Lewis isn't here, but he talked about the basin being the 38 sovereigns because it's inclusive of Mexico. And I could so relate to his conversation about his feelings about being a sovereign and dealing with the United States. Because they're in the same type of situation. So let down the arrogance, United States. We need to work with others. And that's the whole craziness, is that we're all connected to this climate change existential threat. But somehow, like you said, it's still been siloed. And maybe that will alleviate the extreme desire to protect and defend unintended consequences of growing things in the desert, number one. And unintended consequences of this current policy that, again, is lethal. We heard yesterday about the problem of the Salton Sea. How can we minimize, the dying of migrant farm workers from an unintended consequence and call it a problem? It's far beyond that. And if we don't recognize and minimize, if we don't stop minimizing and start recognizing each other's humanity, then people die again. And I just keep going back to that because that's just what's in my head. But if we were to create relationships, let down our ego and our self-righteousness, we could create global food systems that make some sense. It's so silly how we operate. And a lot of you have heard me say, that's my one favorite word during this time in terms of the continued perpetuation of the status quo. It's silly. It's incredibly silly. And why do we do it? Are we sheep? And that's the thing, is like most people in this room are grounded in similar values. So what the heck are we fighting over? And I would assert that the trajectory should be in the future that water is for sharing. And it should be like universal health care. And then we really wouldn't be having this conversation today. So why is it that we don't have universal access to clean water as I speak? And why is it that we focus in on the allocation and the proportions that are allocated rather than talking about the things I love to talk about, kindness, love, and generosity, and what is that, and tolerance, and what does that look like built into the fabric of protecting something that we all value? It doesn't seem that difficult to me. And so when I think of the future, I absolutely think of my grandnephews, my nieces, and that young baby back there, because we weren't handed a baton. We all had to figure it out ourselves. But what a cool thing that we're building the construct of being able to hand the baton to that little girl so she'll be the next chairwoman Flores. And by that time, I envision that if we get rid of the commodity aspect of water completely and have it, then we wouldn't have the situation in terms of having to reconcile, all the things that we need to. And at the heart of this matter, I would assert that we have a morally and spiritually bankrupt country. And if that's the case, the human spark and the human connection, I think, is going to get us to that next place.
Powerful. Thank you, Daryl. Sam, you're pretty good at going second, it seems.
I'll do that. I used to play second base too,
So for the clarity for the audience, and I always value this when I'm in the audience, the question we're going on about at this point is, looking beyond post-2026 processes, procedural improvements, ideas in terms of types of parties that should be engaged and how the processes are designed. Thanks.
Yeah, and since we only have 4 more hours, I'm going to go ahead and make this short. We have a variety of things we can talk about in this context. The first, I think, and foremost, is that we need to get our priorities straight. If we want to continue to draw population to the West, and we want to continue to eat food that is not corn or soybeans, then we really need to figure out long-term how we're going to make that happen, how we are going to make economic development congruent with continued food security. Because by show of hands, how many of you grow your own food? Right? I do, but only part of my diet, right? No one of us grows what we need to continue to survive and thrive, we have to rely on each other. And yet we're drawing more and more and more population out to the west. So we're gonna need to figure out how to get our priorities straight, and that takes education. And I don't want to necessarily pick on upper or lower basin, but let me point out a few things that really drive me crazy when I'm traveling. One, when a pitcher of water is set on your table at a restaurant when nobody ordered water. Two, when we eat American-sized portions, but only a fourth of the plate and the rest of it goes in the trash. When we want to talk about more crop per drop, we should also be talking about how much water we are throwing in the trash through waste. We need the general public to understand what the people in this room already understand. And yet, by show of hands, how many in here are under the age of 35? It's a pretty decent amount, but it's not enough, right? We are not doing enough to do the outreach. The young lawyer division in New Mexico stops at 35 years old, right? We don't have enough of the younger generation coming up understanding exactly what we do in these rooms and why we do it. And then on top of that, we don't have the general public understanding what we do and why we do it. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago at the Family Farm Alliance conference, we played a YouTube video at the outset of our conference to lay the foundation for what we were going to talk about that year. And we played, and it's still on YouTube, you can still find it. We played a video of a school bus pulls up to a farm, and a group of children are coming off of the school bus, and they're very excited to go on a farm tour that day. And one of them comes off the bus screaming in excitement, "I can't wait to see the pigs lay bacon." Now, I don't want to be the one to break it to him, right? But he probably doesn't want to visit my farm either. We have to get realistic about our priorities and how we're communicating those priorities to the public. And that is not to say that the negotiators need more people in the room. I want to be very clear about that. Public input needs to happen in a structured and feasible way, but when you are one of the negotiators sitting in that pressure cooker, adding even one more voice becomes very problematic, right? You can't even get to a majority consensus with the people in the room, and then you're talking about, let's expand the conversation. We have to figure out a way to make sure the public is coming along with us so that when we start talking about strict priority administration or shortage sharing, which is what we like to do in New Mexico, we have the priority doctrine, but we are also the land of mañana, and mañana does not mean tomorrow, it just means not today. So we shortage share because we avoid making hard decisions, and that's really and truly where we land in New Mexico a lot of the time. I do not have the same background that some of my colleagues have in other states in terms of the lack of collaboration with tribal interests, because in my state, every time I needed to get something done, I went straight to the tribes first. The tribal and Pueblo interests are far and away the most helpful when it comes to actually understanding agriculture and food security and our need to protect the environment while also feeding the world and our population. And so we have to figure out a way to start essentially prioritizing Western ag. It's easy to take shots at us. We grow food in the desert, we sure do. But we're not growing your soybeans and your corn. And unless you guys only want to eat those two crops, we need the variety of fruits and vegetables and nuts and forage crops that feed what we eat, right? That's feed for what we eat. So we've got to figure out how we're going to get our priorities straight, prioritize food and water security, and then move on to the privileges that we're so accustomed to. But the problem we have right now is that we are bankrupting ourselves. And what I will say to that is my dad had a saying when I was in college and living off of him. He used to tell me, and he's the only person in the world who can get away with calling me Sammy, but he used to tell me, Sammy, you better stop living a champagne lifestyle on a beer budget. And we have very serious problems with our society thinking that all of these privileges that we have set up in high water years are going to continue on forever without the work that it takes to make that happen. And so if we're not educating the public and we're sitting in our silo in this room, we're not doing that outreach that needs to be done to make sure that the general public can come along with us when we make hard decisions or when we punt them into the next week. But along with that, we need to start being more clear and open, both with ourselves and with others. So from the ag community, I can tell you it's hard to talk about things like fallowing. I hate it. But I have farmers who are less than marginal. And so when you're talking about the need for water, and you have farmers that are not understanding their own practices on their own farm because they don't have the technology to do it, we really have to start thinking about tough decisions. Instead of hiding the ball from ourselves and from our neighbors, we need to start prioritizing openness, and that's not transparency. Transparency implies that we still have some sort of thin veil between us. Openness is us being able to reach through that window and hug each other, and until we are open with both ourselves and our neighbors about what our shortcomings are in terms of our own water use, and we're never going to get to be able to prioritize our outcomes, and we're never going to be able to secure our future in terms of water and infrastructure and food security.
So much food for thought. Thank you very much. I
Like
know
the pun, but
I try. I know a decent piece of what you said connects to work John's done, including in his PhD dissertation at this university. So I was just thinking John might be a natural next speaker on that thread.
Sure, thanks, Jason. And I do appreciate the nod to future generations and thinking about that when we're talking about decision making. I have to brag for a second. Our 4-year-old daughter's favorite stuffy is a humpback chub, and when Reclamation opened up the public comment period, she wrote a public comment to Reclamation, and it said, "To Reclamation, please protect the humpback chub in the Colorado River." She signed it and drew a humpback chub, and we mailed it. It is a part of the official record. I think it's entry 18,100 and something, but you can see her letter. And I do think it's important to think about future generations in all this. And so the question of post 2026 and in process, I mean, clearly the current system of outcome-based, reactive, crisis mode year to year is it's not working. It has maybe worked in the past, but we're reaching that breaking point. And we need to move to a proactive way of managing the system that gets ahead of some of the challenges we're facing and embeds flexibilities throughout the system. I think this year is a great example of that shortcoming. I mean, some of the worst hydrology, reservoirs are incredibly low, and some of the policy levers we have to pull might protect the system, but they come at great political and hydrological and legal risk. And you look at Reclamation's latest modeling, it's like they protect 3,500 at Lake Powell, but it kind of hovers there for a bit, and that's a little nerve-wracking to get that close. And so thinking through what are some of the things that we could be doing, and again, this year is a great example that some of the solutions that have been talked about are conservation pools and what we can do with that water once it's conserved. And so if ICS, there's over 3 million acre feet of ICS currently in Lake Mead, and if that was one of these operationally neutral pools this year, we could have used that to help protect Powell rather than some of these other levers that have pretty significant consequences. So I think, how do we embed those all? And so as Jason said, I did my PhD here, and I've been thinking a lot about what this means to be proactive and process-based and flexible. And the way I think about it is in terms of adaptive capacity. And there's kind of 4 things I think are important when thinking about adaptive capacity, and I'll run through them quickly, but balancing inclusivity and privacy, embracing transformative change through incrementalism, recognizing the importance of individuals, and using informal networks in the informality. So balancing inclusivity and privacy, I think, on the stage last year, Colby Pellegrino from Southern Nevada talked about the states need room to negotiate. They need their private room, and there's some good arguments for that. And I think what was talked about earlier, and if you add more people in the room, it becomes even more challenging. So clearly there's a need for some sort of ability for the states to have frank conversations with each other, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have more broad participation, more value shouldn't be heard, and so finding some ways to build in that inclusivity, I think, is essential for adaptive capacity. Embracing transformative change through incrementalism, I think, I don't know anyone who would say we don't need transformative change. Like the system's clearly not working, but there are a lot of challenges to transformative change. And what I think we can get there is if we take an incremental approach. Let's try some things. Let's experiment. Let's pilot. Let's do something new. Let's do something creative. It might not work perfectly, but it's going to move the needle. And then suddenly we'll be in a transformative place. We'll look back and say, hey, we responded and we made sure that we were adapting. Recognizing the importance of individuals, I think just looking at kind of how the basins worked in the past, there's been really key individuals, often at the federal level, who are able to do shuttle diplomacy, able to help bring the states together, bridge gaps. If you think of the Bob Snows, Mike Connor, Terry Phelps, Pat Mulroy is going back farther, those folks were key in terms of getting some of the deals done. And so I think it's important to recognize and give folks like that the ability to be included. And then using informality and informal networks. I think, with a lot of what the basin states conversation, I'm not in the room by any means, but you hear that it does seem very formal. It seems like they go in with their legal positions and they have their legal positions and they can't get anywhere, and then they walk out of the room, and finding ways to have a more informal dialogue, I think, is essential for getting to solutions. And so it's often been said that more deals are done in the hallways or the bars at happy hours or the dinners or the coffee shops. And so I would just encourage that, finding ways to build in that informality. And I would suggest that the 7 principles go on a river trip. That's the best way to really hash things out. And I think if I can go and Daryl can go, that'd be great too. But and then I think this gets to do, recognizing we're all humans. And we all have positions, we all have constituents, but we're all humans. And so those are kind of 4 things I think about. And then in terms of what that actually means in practice, one way maybe to institutionalize those or allow those to be built out is something that Jason alluded to with a paper that we wrote recently, which is this idea of a river basin entity, a river basin commission. Something that doesn't supplant the 7-state process. Certainly, like I said, there's a need for that 7-state process, but it builds in or institutionalizes a way for more values to be heard. The idea of a river basin commission goes back over 100 years. It was talked about during the compact. There was sort of one before the compact called the League of the Southwest. And it's actually where the Colorado River Basin is kind of the aberration in terms of this. I think there's 25 compacts, interstate compacts in the US. 17 have some formal commission or authority with different authorities, different structures, but there's a benefit to that. And so I think, again, it's been talked about for years, and what I've always heard over the years when asking folks is about this River Basin Commission, they'll say, we don't need another level of bureaucracy. Hey, the system works, let us do it. But I would argue now that the system's not working. And maybe this is a new way to try to incorporate broader values. And so I think I have some thoughts on how to start it, but the commission's one idea, and then just 2 other brief things on terms of post-2026, or even part of post-2026, is the idea of mediation that has been brought up by the states, and it sounds like they're exploring it. I think it's a great thing, and I think there's some confusion of what a mediator could do, and it's not necessarily a Colorado River substance matter expert. It's not someone who knows the law of the river well. It's someone who knows mediation. And there are professional mediators who can bring parties together over complex issues and help them find not just compromises, but actual, what's referred to as mutual gain solutions. And how do we avoid talking past each other? How do we actually find a solution? And so there's a conflict resolution course at the University of Utah, soon to be Utah State University, that talks about this all, and it's an incredible course, highly recommend it. But one thing they note is often in conflict you have a certain mindset. And some of the mindset that you have in conflict is things like, I am right, they are wrong, I know what happened, I know what matters to them, they are being unreasonable, this is the right solution, I just need to get them to see that, and I have all the evidence to prove that I'm right. So that's kind of the conflict mindset, and that's not going to lead to real solutions. Instead, the center poses you need a curious mindset in these complex matters, and a curious mindset is asking questions like, what is really happening here? What really matters here? What might I be missing? Do I know that is true? How do I know that is true? And what evidence might contradict my beliefs? And what can I learn from this situation? And so that's just a plug for the basin states to really explore this mediated process. There's professional mediators who I think could do a lot. And I really hope if we're moving forward with this 2-year decision-making process, there is the shift, because what's happened over the last 2+ years I think hasn't worked for the state. So let's find something new, and I think a mediator could be that new thing. Real quick, last thing I say post-20, or now, but for the long term, is water institutions are often thought of as very trusted by the public in terms of credible information. What we heard from Brad Udall in climate change, like our water institutions need to be leaders on climate. I think our water agencies, states, everyone need to realize, they all realize the challenge of climate change. Let's start focusing on their own emissions, their own impacts on climate change. It's a global problem. It's going to take, obviously, centuries to fix, but I think our water institutions can start with looking in-house of how they could reduce their own emissions. It's a small part of the climate solution, so I'll stop there.
That was the elevator talk for your dissertation. Thumbs up. No, it's like a volleyball game, and John is setting up our final speaker on this. On the commission thread that John mentioned, James was former State of Colorado's commissioner on the UCRC, Upper Colorado River Commission. So James will be our last speaker as far as this question about post-2026 procedural improvements, et cetera, and then we'll transition to Celine for Q&A. So all yours, James.
Well, I'll use Celine's cupcake metaphor from yesterday to make my comment on this. I think she was, now I was on the road, so I was tuning in virtually, but I think the cupcake concept was kind of cake's boring. The frosting, however, is sexy and glamorous even. And that's where you want to be. And I took that to mean the frosting represents the idea of compensated conservation in the basin. I don't know of another way out of this box. You can take every city off of it, as has been said at this conference multiple years in a row. You can take every city out of the basin and you still have a mass balance problem. So you're not going to solve the problem with taking shorter showers. You're not going to solve the problem by not serving water at restaurants. We should be doing those things because it increases the ethic, and we have to be able to sustain ourselves on less. But we're not going to solve the Colorado River problem unless we touch agriculture. And agriculture, I mean, that's the old, I think it was Pretty Boy Floyd or one of those bank robbers that was here, made into a hero in the 1920s. Like, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why do you go to agriculture when there's a crisis in water? Because that's where the water is. So we have the senior water rights. So if you're going to do strict administration, priority administration, something dealing with administration, you have to talk to agriculture. And so I guess the frosting being conservation programming, we're in Colorado, we're still debating. I'll use this to amend my first answer to your very first question, which was about what's good, what have we been doing right? I will say that the work that's been happening primarily in Utah, but also in New Mexico and also in Wyoming is around demand management is a positive thing because it is taking up the tool, again, to my knowledge, the only tool in the bag that we have to really address this issue, and trying to learn more about it and ask all those probing questions and figure out how we're going to implement a solution that makes the mass balance problem, stabilize. And, so I think the frosting in Colorado, we don't have it. In fact, we're debating whether or not it's a good thing. We're not even sure it is. It's long been the case that this state has been the leader on the Colorado River because 70% of the flow originates in the snowpack in the Rockies that the Mountain Ute council member described very eloquently earlier today. And that dynamic meant that Delph Carpenter from Greeley came up with the idea of applying the Compacts Clause of the US Constitution to this issue, and represented us at Bishop's Lodge when we negotiated it. 1948, Colorado led the way on that negotiation. The papers are at CSU if you are wondering if that's true. The leadership that's come out of Colorado as the headwater state, we have 9 interstate compacts, 2 equitable apportionment decrees with the US Supreme Court, 18 downstream states that get water that starts here. So when it comes to water, we punch above our weight, and we have been able to exercise a leadership role. That is up until now. We are not doing that right now. We have ceded that to other states, and luckily, this is my position, luckily, they have stepped up and they have done something. And they should be applauded for that. And I hope fervently that we in Colorado get off our ass and do something that is emblematic of the urgency. It meets the urgency and the scale that we need to achieve. If you just let's just get back to the math on this river. We got 3.7 million acre feet of inflow coming into Powell. So if we knock down what's going out, even if we knock it down to 6 million acre feet, that's a big delta, right? Right? So you've got to solve that delta. The amounts that they're talking about in the lower basin and they've put on the table in their plan get you part of the way there. Releasing 660 to 1 million acre feet out of Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, and Navajo, that gets you a little closer, but still not all the way. Where's the rest of it going to come from? If we have another 2026 next year, heaven forbid, but if we do, if we're back at this place and it's the same hydrology we had this year, next year, there will have to be 3 million acre feet that show up somewhere in order to save Powell. And it can't, in addition to what the lower basin's doing, and in addition to the releases, the DROA releases out of Powell, down to Powell from Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, and Navajo. So the math is not mathing here. And to pretend that it is, and the clock's running. So I get that the tradition at convenings like this, like CRUA, is we'll see you next year. We won't see you next year. We will be doing this, whether anybody likes it, between now and the end of probably the water year. And the decisions will have to get made, or they will be made for us, as I've already alluded to. And we're not gonna like that. So, John Insminger, Becky Mitchell, all of them that alluded to this, complete and utter failure if we end up in court. That is totally true. We have these 9 interstate compacts. We are the mother of interstate stream litigation. We've done it on the Arkansas. We're doing it with Nebraska on the South Platte. We've done it on the Rio Grande. The only one we haven't done it on is the Colorado. We know how long that takes. 2 states, 1980 was when the Kansas v. Colorado case started on the Arkansas. It took us until 2002 to get to the final finish line on it. So that's 22 years, that's 2 states. Arizona v. California, you heard that tail of that tape, not until 2006, and that litigation started in the 30s. So, and that was 2 states. We would have just an epic failure. If we set foot in a courtroom, we have already lost, because we have already ceded that authority to the federal government, and you can't unring that bell once it is rung. So, what was the question?
Whatever it was, you answered it unequivocally. Yeah. On that note, yeah, that kind of wraps up the panelists' input on P26 and post P26 questions. Could you give them another round of applause for sticking their necks out? All right. And hand off to Celine for audience Q&A. Please fill the Slido with your questions. Please take advantage of these folks.
All right, I'll start out with some questions that have come in about the idea of the need for a different governance structure or commission. So there are some questions about whether we need different structures to take policy out of the discussions. What does that structure look like? And for James, how do you reshape the process in a way that doesn't overrun the minority?
You guys want me to go first? All right. The governance structure is a challenge because we've set up this 50 laboratories of experimentation in this country, and it has served us very well on certain issues. When we want to do things like onshore chip manufacturing from Taiwan, we opened that up to site selectors that went to each of the different markets around the country that were good for that kind of a fab plant. And Arizona Phoenix won that competition. That is hardening a demand when you do something like that, because you can't let something that's that critical to the national security apparatus and our economy fail. So whether Arizona has a junior priority or not, you have to contend with that reality. You have to contend with the fact that 90% of your green salad in February is from Yuma or Imperial. So that's food, national food security. You can't just say, well, we're just going to apply the law and hope it goes well, because it won't go well, and that's ignorant of the reality. So the governance structure question has to contend with these sovereign states that we came up with because we like keeping governance close to the ground here in our country. And we've also, this is like a perfect storm this year, Professor, because we've got the terrible hydrology, we've all been over that. We've got this political calendar that we're in. This is a midterm election year. We have, in 25 days, midterm primaries in Colorado. Some of you states have already done your primaries. We will have new governors, we'll have new attorneys general, we'll have new leadership in each of our states. And when you're running for those posts, you have a incentive to say that you're gonna fight, Daryl, fight for your water more than, and harder than the opponent. And so that does not leave a lot of space for compromise and negotiation across the states in those calendar years. So we're in the middle of one of those. And then on top of it all, this governance structure needs to have some sort of ability to impose a majority vote, or you have the tyranny of the minority, which is getting to the second part of that question. I get the minority problem, and specifically the tribes and their interests that have long been overlooked, not invited to the table. Even when they've been invited to the table, they haven't been given chips to play the poker game, is the analogy I've used in the past. The infrastructure hasn't been there. The investment that is necessary to put the water to use hasn't been there for the tribes. That has to be contended with. But I think it's gonna take a stepping up on the part of if we're not getting rid of these sovereign states anytime soon. So we're gonna have to saddle these negotiators that are in the room, whether it's on a commission or whether it's in 7 state meetings. They are going to have to represent every single human being in their borders. And they've got to do a better job. And I'll take full responsibility. When I was the commissioner in Colorado, the Ute-Mountain Ute and the Southern Ute, we talked on occasion, but we weren't talking all the time. And we should have done a better job at that. I think that ship is turning. because of the efforts of the tribal members in the room at conferences like this. More work to be done for sure. But the states, if the states are going to be locked in those rooms, they have to go with the imprimatur and the interests of all of the people in their state, because like it or not, that's how the 22 Compact was written. The Section 7 that you read, Daryl, is exactly right. The other section that applies to Indian country is the provision that says that the states have to absorb whatever the uses of the tribes are under their apportionment. So it's incumbent on the states to get with their tribes and with not their tribes, they don't own the tribes are sovereign. The tribes and the states need to be having bilateral negotiations and conversations before the state principal goes into that room. And it doesn't sound like that's happening. So on the governance question, I could keep going, I'm gonna shut up.
Thanks, Celine, for the question. And one of the things about the policy brief is that hopefully it'll connect dots in terms of the importance of the recognition of tribal sovereignty as it precedes this federal government sovereignty and the state sovereignty. And so hopefully it makes a case for parity of sovereignty. Because in my state, in terms of average budget a year, it's like 10 billion running over 20 years. And states get a small little portion of that. And when you think about that, and you have 98% leakage off tribal reservations of incomes, wages, salaries, we're not represented at all in state government. We have no say in state government. I appreciate my cousin Benny for being a senator, but that doesn't, and I know that they try to direct monies toward tribes, but ultimately it's a state sovereign structure. And the problem with this tribal settlement is this, just like Indian gaming. In order for us to go through a settlement, we have to cede sovereignty again, and that's ridiculous. That we have to go through a state adjudication process that's based on beneficial use and prior appropriation that's inconsistent with future reserve rights, and those processes and structures have never been created in the state. Why? Because there's been an institutional theft of tribal natural resources in the basin, most predominantly water. And the states and the federal government are complicit in that theft of water. And how do we know this? Because we did a tribal water study, and it was the first time tribal water had ever been modeled in the Colorado River Basin. Ever. And so we found out real quickly that there's a gap there of maybe $900 to close to $1 million of unused, uncompensated, undeveloped tribal water. And guess where that's going? It's going to solve all the basin's problems. Meanwhile, we don't have access to clean water and infrastructure on our reservations. Wow, that's not right. And then in 1934, something called the Indian Reorganization Act had us adopt 3 branch governments. And yeah, maybe we could say we were a choice to do that, but not really. My tribe adopted it in 1934 so we could align with the federal government, so we could get stale flour and lard. And today, that 3-branch government that we adopted so we could survive is still in place. And it's having the same results as this 3-branch government. And so my challenge with the sovereignty brief is to build on the Jicarilla transaction in New Mexico, when it was the first sovereign-to-sovereign transaction in 750 years of patriarchal, racist, bigoted, controlling governance in our state. And exclusionary. Build on that, because that's what we need to build on, because it recognized our sovereignty for the very first time in my own state. And so, and again, if you don't have, an ability, and so that's what's the reality of what's been happening, and it needs to be told over and over and over again, because our story has been whitewashed to the broadest extent. And I use the Native American Museum as an example. I don't give much kudos to Rick Carlisle at all, because he created an art museum. And I got to be on a trip with a guy named Kurt Johnson, and a lot of you might know him, but he's the head of the Smithsonian. There's over 2 million artifacts that are stored in warehouses in the basement of the Smithsonian. That's our genocidal history. We don't have a Holocaust museum. We have an art museum. And it's silly. And so when we think about governance, absolutely we need a new governance structure, because this one doesn't work. It kills people. And it doesn't provide equal access and equal opportunities in terms of those flexible tools that have been offered to the rest of the basin, which are unconscionable. During the time when this was happening in the Upper Basin, DCP was happening, and guess what? Conservation and fallowing, you're getting $500 an acre. Meanwhile, in the Upper Basin, you had that situation with unused, uncompensated, undeveloped water. It's not right, and it just has to stop. And one of the things that, when we're thinking about a new governance structure, absolutely create that state table in my state so that we meet with 25 sovereigns and we split that gross receipts tax and that severance tax equally, because we generate most of it. And why don't we get it? I don't know, Ben Ray Lujan. It's because, the entrenched, patriarchy that needs to be absolutely destroyed in my state, because it's killing the tribal sovereigns in my state. And unless we change that governance structure to be inclusive of all those 25 sovereigns, then we just have the status quo. And the sad thing is that, assimilation is for real. It got pounded into us over decades. Assimilation, termination, relocation. And we had to relocate because there are, for the most part, no revolving economies on reservations. So we have to go elsewhere to find a living. So that genocidal process is still active. And if we don't change it, then we will be continue to be known as merciless savages. And the foundation of how this country dehumanizes the 575 federally recognized tribes is unconscionable, in terms of the fact that you still call us Indians. We're not from India. Holy crap. Wouldn't that be the start of recognizing that I'm Hickorea? I'm going to go talk to the Hickoreas, because when I got here 10 years ago, you heard that a lot. I'm going to go talk to the Indians. We're going to come up with an Indian solution to a human problem. So absolutely, we need to change governance structures. And the state governance structures need to realize that tribal sovereigns have parity of sovereignty, and it precedes theirs.
All right. I want to acknowledge that this question has been asked in some of the other panels, and I haven't been able to get to it before, so I want to get to it now. Do the panelists see that the percentage approach as the key to addressing the Colorado River problem? What would this approach entail, and why can't we get there?
Yeah, the Lower Rio Grande doesn't know anything but percentages. I wouldn't know how to approach this problem from a different perspective. I'm sort of handicapped in that way because I live with the reality of 57-43. That's my percentage, and it's split essentially 57% of the surface supply goes to my district, 43% goes to the Texas district, but the country of Mexico's share comes off the top of that, and it is accounted for prior to delivery to my district. So the short answer is, there's your foundation.
And I would just say, Selene, that I would suggest that, states and non-tribal sovereigns do whatever you want. Take the future reserve tribal water rights off the top, and then you do what you want. And I love what Jay Weiner had to say. You had 100 years, and your best thinking got us here. Let us try it for the next 100 years.
I'll just add on that's the fundamental challenge with climate change is we don't know what to expect. We know the trend is down, but how much down and how fast down, we don't know for sure. This year's a good example of how quickly the bottom can fall out, and so we need to respond to it in a way, and maybe percentages is the way to go. That is the way to respond, or is it, and maybe it's not the exact way the states were talking about, but there's other ways to embed proportional allocations and responding to what the hydrology is actually doing and building in that flexibility to handle years like this. And so I don't want to be super prescriptive in saying, yes, it's got to be 62% or 68% or 64%, whatever, in terms of upper to lower basin, but I think that level of thinking needs to be embedded in any new guidelines, because if anyone is able to tell you what's happening in climate change in the next 10 years, other than it's going to be bad, I wouldn't believe them, so.
So just by de facto, you will get to percentages the minute you take Powell and Meade out of the equation. If you're doing a run of the river down to the lower basin, you're no longer, the upper basin already does percentages. We've got 51.75% in Colorado of the water available for use. So, and as everybody knows, because we've been talking about it ad nauseum, we've never used anywhere near 51.75% of 7.5 million acre feet. We've always used about half of 4 million acre feet. So 2 million acre feet in Colorado, rough justice, is what we've used. The lower basin has never had to do that because they have the nation's 2 largest reservoirs parked up above them. And as long as those have water in them, they don't have to worry about percentages, but they will, whether we design or rewrite the compact or anything else, they will have to manage to a percentage. 44, I'm a lawyer, I was told there would be no math. 44%, 4.4 million acre feet, California's apportionment of 7.5 is 58.7%. So that's what California would have to manage to if they were having to, figure out a run of the river type of situation. And these percentages work really well if you're applying them to big numbers. If you're applying them to small numbers, they don't work super well, and it becomes, contentious, litigious. That's right.
In my district.
So it's 5 to the hour. My sense is we probably have time for one more solid question.
All right. Is reclamation remiss in not giving more seriousness to meeting the Colorado's needs as a living ecosystem? Why or why not?
I'm happy to start with that one. I think Carlos this morning laid it out really well, which is ecological resilience is the key to it all. And if you don't have a functioning river, you don't have water supplies, you don't have allocations, you don't have reservoir storage. And so embedding the health of the river in any guidelines is essential for successful guidelines in general, I think, and that's been missing. And I think, I think reclamation has been moving in a better direction. They've acknowledged the importance of thinking about river health, but I want to see it systematically included, embedding environmental stewardship into every decision that's made, and instead of just operating reservoirs based on metrics, and if there's this much water, we're going to do this much. Well, if there's this much water and the environmental conditions are such, let's adjust. Let's maybe modify so we can better incorporate environmental values into the decision-making process. And I want to emphasize that I think it doesn't have to be a either or. I think there's ways to be smart and find win-wins or win-win-wins. And I think the DROA example this year is a good example of what this could look like. Whereas if we're going to release a significant amount of extra water from Flaming Gorge, let's time it in a way that benefits the endangered fish in the Green River below Flaming Gorge, and they're doing that. That's one example. I think we need to do that throughout the river basin. And so I think there are ways to find to think about that. And it doesn't have to come at the cost of water rights owners or water users. I think it can actually benefit them because, again, as Carlos said, ecological resilience is the key to the whole thing.
You know, what I'll say is our propensity to find blame in any situation has to go away. This concept of should we point at someone because they didn't do something, or should they have done X, Y, or Z, or should reclamation do better, that's not helpful. And I think we can all sit here and agree that the river system needs to be taken care of and we need to prioritize a variety of uses along the way. But to point fingers and say, we are managing for flood control, for loss of water, for municipal interests, for food security, and all these things. And oh my gosh, they missed the mark on one or two of those things. Yeah, that's kind of how this is supposed to happen. We are not perfect, and to continue to point the finger at other people and say, look, they should have done X, Y, or Z, what we all should be doing is pointing the finger at ourselves and looking in the mirror and saying, what can I do to help them do their jobs? What can I do to make sure that the conversation is moving in a positive way, rather than pointing the finger and saying they should have done this and then sitting back with your arms crossed?
Daryl, James, you have any closing thoughts on the Living River
I would
question?
love to just say, like, thinking about balance, heard that word yesterday, balance, what does that mean? And in the indigenous world, that's very, very important. We talk about balance. We talk about things being in place and where they should be. And on right now, going through this existential threat of climate change and 8 billion people on this planet, people are watching about, well, how we're going to deal with the scarcity of water in the West. And being that there's 40 million people in this basin, I'll say it again, there's absolutely something to be learned from over 20,000 years of sustainable, adaptable resilience existence in this basin. We might have some knowledge about how to continue on, but we need your help because we weren't included and we didn't build the necessary capacity like the country of Mexico to a certain degree. And so, if this is going to be built together, that understanding and has to happen collectively. And in my mind, this is, I know a lot of the tribal leaders are gone now, but hopefully they're watching and they'll get this message. But, take the opportunity to practice and exercise your sovereignty. That sovereignty brief was written mostly for you to practice and exercising sovereignty because we're so ingrained in wardship that we need permission from somebody to do something. And guess what? We don't. And you're going to probably be seeing a whole lot more of that exercise of sovereignty in being helpful, not hurting. Because I would assert that if those 24 tribal sovereigns were on board with the litigation with Texas, it might have made a difference. I'm not sure. But politically, it may have. But we were never asked. And that's the arrogance of state government as well. And we see that like in this state right now, where you had a situation where, Nighthorse Campbell still doesn't deliver water to the Utes or the Ute Mountains. And a comparison that's so important. I read somewhere that Colorado uses about 5,000 acre feet to make snow, to slide down a hill. when my brother here doesn't have a settlement yet. That's inequity. And you can't justify it by creating a recreational component. It's ridiculous. And again, I go back to, it's silly.
All right. Yeah,
No more
James, by
time.
all means.
Okay, so kind of blending John and Sam's comments and a little bit of Daryl's too, in that yesterday we heard a lot about, a litany of barriers, legal, political, economic. This question's about environmental complexities that are associated with doing things on this river, managing reservoirs, doing things like conservation, compensated conservation programming. We heard all sorts of reasons why that's really hard and you can't ever, we'll never be able to measure it, and how can we shepherd it? And we've got the tools to do all of that. We do it on a daily basis with administration. The division, the state engineer was here earlier. He's got his finger on the pulse. He's got a whole apparatus that does that. And each one of our states, New Mexico, Wyoming, Utah, has the same setup. So I guess those constraints are real. The environmental constraints are real. But if the entire discussion becomes a recital of barriers, then governance itself becomes the obstacle and we're cooked. We're not going to make it. We have to figure out a paradigm shift that does what John was talking about and what Sam was talking about, which is stop pointing your finger. If we're going to make releases, DROA releases, let's time it so that it does some good for the fish. If I'm going to leave water in my head gate on Plateau Creek, then why don't you take that into account with the in-stream flow regime that's on that creek lower down? We can hit those molecules can hit the right place at the right time and the right amount, and we can do some really cool things, or at least make lemonade out of lemons, and survive to the next go around. But if we keep just debating and having committees, Colorado's debated demand management for years, and we have nothing to show for it. Not a single drop has been banked in the demand management account in Lake Powell. Not a single drop. And that was created in 2019. So we've had 7 years where we could have done something, and we've done nothing. That is the change that has to happen. And I hope when we're back here next year, we're talking about all the cool things we did, and we did them in ways that had these joint benefits associated with them.
Okay, thanks, James. Before we express gratitude to the panelists, I have a question for you all. And by you all, I mean the folks who are in the room now, the folks on Zoom watching in real time, or the folks who choose to watch the recordings afterwards. Would you be willing to answer the same questions that the panelists did? So my colleagues and I have built a research webpage. It's on the Water and Tribes Initiative website. And the webpage is basic and asks for the same input on those questions. Do you have thoughts on the positives of the post-2026 process? Constructive criticisms of the post-2026 process? Ideas for what decision-making over Colorado River management, the who and the how, should look like moving forward from the post-2026 process? We want to crowdsource your input. You are being recruited. Again, folks in person and folks online. The link for that website, or webpage, will be sent graciously by Annie Carlossi afterwards. It'll also be blasted on social media. We would love to hear from you. And if this is an incentive, if you don't have another incentive, we will compile the input into a report that synthesizes the input. And there is a field on the webpage where you can enter your email address if you want to be on the receiving end of that report and hear what other people had to say. So love to hear from you. That's all I got. Back to them. Let's give them a round of applause.